So today's daf is Kuf Mem Aleph 141. We're going to start from the new Mishnah at the bottom of Kuf Mem Amud Bet, which is where we left off yesterday. Gorfin milifnei petam salkin tzdadim b'pnei ra'i. So we're going to take the way that Rashi interprets this, which is that one can move the food in front of what they call a petam here means basically an ox that they're fattening up. So they would feed him with, So they would feed him in his stable or whatever. And so it says you can sweep aside the food so that it doesn't get mixed in with dirt. In other words, you're allowed to move around his food on Shabbat. Rashi says, so you can basically move his trough around and to both add food to it and also make sure that it doesn't get any impurities in it or any dirt or anything like that the animal won't want to eat or might make the animal not eat its food. It means that you can move his food to the side so that he doesn't defecate on it, basically, so that he doesn't ruin his food by going to the bathroom on his own food, which we wouldn't want to happen because then he's not going to eat his food and he won't be fattened up. That's what Rabbi Dosa says. The rabbis forbid. We're going to see in the Gemara exactly which case the rabbis forbid. It's not clear which of these two cases is it whether you can sweep the food around or remove the food in front of the animal, or whether he disagrees, or whether the rabbis disagree with the second case where you can move it to the side. We're going to see you can move food from one animal to another on Shabbat. In other words, if animal A didn't finish his food, you can move it to animal B and let him finish up the food. So these are all rules related to exertion on behalf of animals on Shabbat and what the extent is that one can move things around on Shabbat. And obviously we're allowed to care for animals and allowed to feed them. We want to make sure that their food is replenished properly and is edible to them or appealing to them so that they will eat. So we have to move it, or we have to replenish it, or we have to remove it sometimes, or we have to transfer it from one animal to another. So now the Gemara says, Ibailu, they asked a question. Rabbanan aresha plige or asefa plige. We know that there's an argument in our Mishnah between Rabbi Dosa and the Chachamim. What is the argument? Do they disagree about the first case? In other words, the first case of gorfin milifnei petam, that you can clean out his trough and put more straw in it, right? In order to give him clean food. Is that is that where they disagreed, or did they disagree with the second case?
It's okay.
That's the question. Well, the first opinion said it was okay. The Chachamim in food, right. So, but the question is not muqteh. The question is whether it is too much work, too much exertion on Shabbat. So, because it's for the animal can eat it, he just might not like it that much. So, do I really have to go on Shabbat and start cleaning out troughs and everything? Yeah, it's like doing extra things that are not necessary. Or tarvayu pelige, or do they disagree about both cases? Case one is the case where you are emptying out and replenishing the food of the animal. Case number two is when you're moving it to the side so that he doesn't go to the bathroom on his own food. So which case are they disagreeing with? One, two, or both of them? So Tashma come in here. Tanya, as we learned in a Braita, that the rabbis disagree in both cases. They say you cannot clean out his trough and you cannot move the food to the side. What's the reason? Because in both of these cases, really it's a matter of aesthetics. The animal won't like the food as much because it's been ruined, it's gotten dirty, but it's not preventing the animal from eating. You're allowed to feed animals, but how much do you have to dote on your animals on Shabbat? Do you really have to go to the level of cleaning out the trough to make sure that the food is just right and just so clean and all that? That far you don't have to go on Shabbat. Do it after.
How finicky they are.
Right, depends how finicky they are, but apparently they're not that finicky. They're not going to die from it, so you don't need to go. You don't have to go that far to make them super comfortable and luxurious. Amar Rav Chisda says machloket be'evus shel karka. Where is this machloket about whether you can sweep out the trough? He says this is only when it's in the ground, when the animal's eating off of something in the ground. But aval be'evus shel kli, but when he actually has a trough, an actual vessel, so there it's raised off the ground. So divrei kol mutar. Everybody says that that's allowed. So then the Gemara asks, be'evus shel karka mi ika leman deshareh hakam mishave gumot. What are you talking about, Rav Chisda? It's the opposite. If he's eating off the floor and you sweep it out, you're sweeping the dirt floor. And therefore you're going to be evening out the floor, and we know that you're not allowed to even out the floor on Shabbat. That's a much worse problem. Rather, the statement of Rav Chisda must have been as follows: Amar Rav Chisda, machloket beivus shel kili, aval beivus shel karka divrei kol asur. That everybody agrees, yes, about the floor, but what they agree is that you can't sweep it out. In other words, if this straw is in a trough that's a vessel, that's where you have an argument between the rabbis and Rabbi Dosa, whether it's too much exertion to be sweeping that out and replenishing the straw on Shabbat. But everybody agrees that if it's on the ground, you can't sweep the ground, because what you're going to end up doing is flattening the ground, and that would be a separate violation of Shabbat of improving the ground. You can take food from one animal and present it to another animal. Tana chadan notnim lefnei behema shepiyar yafa v'notnim lefnei behema shepiyar ra v'tanya idach notlin lefnei behema shepiyar ra v'notnim lefnei behema shepiyar yafa. So we have one version, one braita that tells us that you can take from an animal that has a good mouth and put it in front of an animal that has a bad mouth. And the other braita says you can take from an animal that has a bad mouth and you can put it in front of an animal that has a good mouth. I think it's talking about, that comic dog. What's the name of that dog? He has a foul mouth. You know that he goes to those award shows? Yeah, no, it's not talking about him. It means, but what does it mean by a bad mouth? So one is saying you can take from an animal with a good mouth and give it to a bad mouth, but not the other way around. And one is saying you can take it from a bad-mouthed animal and give it to a good mouth, but not the other way around. So what does it mean, bad mouth, good mouth? Well, what is this talking about here, and what's the argument here? Amar Abaye says, "Idi v'idi mekameh chamra lekameh Torah shaklinan, mekameh Torah lekameh chamra lo shaklinan." Both of them mean exactly the same thing. Okay, both of them mean the same thing. Meaning, and what do they both mean? They both mean you can take food from a donkey and give it to an ox, but you can't take food from an ox and give it to a donkey. But in one braita, the donkey is being called the bad mouth, and the ox is being called the good mouth. And in one braita, it's switched around. The donkey is being called the good mouth, and the ox is being called the bad mouth. So why is that? So now it explains. So in the first one, it calls the chamor, it calls the donkey it calls the donkey the one with the good mouth, because a donkey doesn't drool on its food. So it says you can take food from the donkey and put it in front of the ox. You can take it from the animal that has a good mouth, because the donkey doesn't drool on its food, and give it to the ox that does drool on its food. However, notlin milafnei behema shepia ra, b'chamor delo dayek v'yachil, v'notnin lefnei behema shepia yafeh, v'parad dayika v'achla. Why does it say then? In other words, if in both cases it's telling you the same halacha, that you can only take from a donkey and give to an ox. You can't take from an ox and give to a donkey. So in what way? Why would it in one case call the donkey the good mouth and the ox the bad mouth, and in the other case called the donkey the bad mouth and the ox the good mouth? The answer is because in a certain way the donkey has a better mouth, because he doesn't drool on his food. But he has a bad mouth because he's not a discerning eater. He'll eat trash. He'll eat anything. The ox, on the other hand, has bad habits when he eats because he drools on his food, but he's very discerning and selective about what he eats. So in that case, it's called piha yafeh. It has a good mouth, meaning that it won't just put anything in its mouth. So you can take from the donkey to give to the ox, but not vice versa is the halacha. Now we come to the Mishnah. It says, Hakash al gabei mita lo yinana'enu biyado, ela minana'o begufo. That let's say somebody left some straw. We're on Kuf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph on the Mishnah. If you left some straw on the bed, straw is muktzeh. Now we're talking about muktzeh here. Straw is muktzeh because it doesn't have any function, and we're assuming it's not animal fodder. It's just straw. So you can't move it with your hand on Shabbat, but you can lie down on the bed. Okay, minana'o begufo, you can lie in the bed.
That means there's straw that serves as
somebody just left some straw on your bed. It's just random straw sitting on your bed. You meant to put it in the barn.
So
it's not food though. It's muktzeh. Unless it could be food. If it could be food, that's what he says next. He says ve'emaya machal behema. If it's machal behema, if it's the food of an animal, o shaya alav kar o sadin minana obiado, or you put over it the bedspread, or you put over it the sheet. In other words, it's clear that you wanted to sleep on the straw, so you put a sheet over the straw to make it a bed. you put a pillow on the straw, it shows that you wanted to sleep on it, so you designated it for sleeping. But if somebody just left straw that was supposed to be for building purposes or for making bricks or something, they left it on your bed, it's muktzeh because let's just assume it's used normally for either for construction or for whatever, and it was left on your bed. If it's animal fodder, it's not a question. If you made it into your bed, it's not a question either. The only question is when it's something stam, we just assume that it's for some kind of construction purposes of some sort. Maybe one of the little piggies is going to be making their house to protect them from the big bad wolf. The first one made it out of straw. So this is the straw that he left it on your bed. And now you can sleep on the bed. In other words, if you lie in the bed and push the straw off with your body, that's okay. That's called tiltul minatzad, as we're going to see. Moving it with your hand, picking it up, you're not allowed to do. But you can sit next to it. Let's say somebody left their wallet or left something muktzah on a seat. You could sit on the chair and you push it off by sitting on the chair. You just can't push it with your hands. Okay? Now, then we said, a machbesh shel balei batim. The professional dry cleaners, they would have this very large press, a very large press for clothing. Yeah. So this very large press that they would push down, matirin. So if it's shel balei batim, if it's your personal one in your house, you can open it. Aval lo kovshin. Obviously, you cannot press clothing on Shabbat. But you're allowed to open, if you had left some clothes in the press in your house on Shabbat, you're allowed to open it. But shel kovsin, but the professional one that's very large, lo yigabo, you can't even touch it, it's totally muktzeh, because since Rashi says that it's closed with very, very tightly. So tightly that opening and closing it is considered like building and dismantling a real structure. Because it's so tightly closed over the clothing. So therefore, the professional grade press that they had, that was used by a professional launderer, you're not allowed to open it on Shabbat, even if you left clothes in there. You can't touch it at all. Because opening it and closing it is considered like constructing and deconstructing. As opposed to the one in your house where it's something which easily is open and closed, and so therefore it's not a problem to remove clothing from the press as long as you don't press any clothing. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im hayam mutar me'erev Shabbat, matzirot kulo v'shomato. Rabbi Yehuda says if it was partially loosened before Shabbat, even the professional grade one, if it was partially loosened, you can open it the rest of the way. It's just that you're not allowed to take it from a state of being totally closed to a state of being open. But if it was partially loosened before Shabbat, that is a different story. Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman says, Hi Pugla, if you have a radish, now this was a case we saw before earlier in the Masechet, and we're going to see now a series of several different cases, some of which overlap with cases we've seen before. He says if you have a radish, and this radish is bulb shaped, okay? So if it's bulb shaped, that means if it's milmala lemata, it's such that it's placed that the wide part is on top and the skinny part is in the dirt. Now you put it there to preserve it. It's not planted, because if it's planted, obviously you can't take it out. But it's put into the dirt to keep it cool. That was like their method of refrigeration. So when you pull it out, you're not really going to be pulling out any dirt, because the wide part is on top. Okay, so when you pull it, you can pull it out, no problem. But if it's milmata lemala, if the bottom is facing upwards, so the wide part is underneath, and you're going to have to take from the narrow part. And when you take from the narrow part, you're going to be pulling a lot of dirt up with it. So he says that you're not allowed to do because you're going to pull up too much dirt. Amar Ravada bar Ava. Ravada bar Ava says, Amrei beRav. They said in the house of Rav, in the Beit Midrash of Rav, Tanena delake Rav Nachman. We learned against Rav Nachman in our Mishnah, because akashal gabe amita lo yinaneo biyado aval minaneo begufo, because it says that you can, if you have straw on your bed that was left there and it's muktzeh, it's not allowed to be handled by hand, but you can lie next to it on the bed and push it off. And we said also that if it had a bedspread put over it, or whatever, a pillow put on it, or a sheet put on it, or it was animal fodder, then you could move it. But the point is, shemamina tiltul minatzad la shemetiltul. We see from this, though, that you're allowed to lie next to the straw and push it off with your body. That means tiltul minatzad, indirect moving, is not considered moving. So here too, in Rav Nachman's case, pulling the radish, even if you pull dirt up with the radish out of the ground, that's tiltul minatzad. That's indirect pulling, because what are you really pulling? The radish, not the dirt. You're not touching the dirt directly. So they said we learn a contradiction, so therefore we reject Rav Nachman's view, because we say that tiltul minatzad, indirect touching when you're, with your body or something, when you move your body, you sit down on the seat and something falls off the seat, that is not considered touching at all. And so too here, pulling the radish out of the ground is not going to be considered moving the dirt.
What's the difference between tiltul minatzad and the Shenu Mitkaven?
Dar shalom mitkaven is where you don't intend to do something. Here, you might very well intend to knock the straw off, but you're doing it by just getting into the bed. Intention doesn't really matter. It's the indirectness of the indirectness of the action.
Intention doesn't really matter
In this case. In this case, intention doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is that you moved it with your body rather than with your hand, rather than the normal way. Because muktzeh is a rabbinical thing anyway. Amar Rav Yehuda says, "Hanei pilpelei midak chada chada bekata desakina sharei tarte asir." So Rav Yehuda says, if you have peppercorns, basically, you have pepper that you want to crush on Shabbat. Now you can't chop things; it's tochen. You can't chop things finely on Shabbat. He says, but you can do something to get around that. Do one peppercorn at a time with the back of the knife, with the handle of the knife. So you're doing two things differently. You're not doing more than one at a time. Normally you would chop a large amount. You're chopping just one at a time, and you're doing it with the back of the knife, so you're showing that you're doing it in an unusual way, and therefore you get out of the problem of tochen. Amar Rava says, Rava Amar, Kevan de Mishaneh afilu tuvanami. Rava says you can do many simultaneously as long as you do it with the back of the knife. In other words, it's enough to do it in an unusual manner. You don't have to express that qualitatively and quantitatively. Once you're qualitatively doing it in an unusual way, how many you do at a time doesn't really matter. That's what Rabbah says. Now, Amar Rav Yehuda says, Man desacheh b'maya, somebody who was swimming in the water, lingiv nafsheh b'reisha vadar lisalik. The person should dry himself off before he comes out of the pool. Dil ba'ateh la'atoyeh dalad amot bekarmelit, because otherwise he might end up carrying 4 amot. He's going to carry the water on his body for 4 amot. Because he's going to be walking around, he's going to come out of the water, and he's going to be walking around with the water on him. He's going to be like carrying the water. So therefore he should dry before he starts walking around. Yeah?
Aren't you not supposed to dry because...
Pat dry. You have to pat dry.
Dry with a towel, dry.
Well, you have to pat dry. You can pat dry.
With a towel, but...
You can pat dry with a towel.
Bringing the towel out.
Without
That's what I heard.
Well, they say you can pat dry, like that's why you can use a towel to wash your hands. Don't you when you do Netilat Yadayim, don't you use a towel?
Of course.
Okay,
yes.
So there you go.
Okay, but it's
Yeah.
a lot of water.
It's not supposed to, you're not supposed to absorb, a significant amount in there. But I don't think that would necessarily happen unless you're really wet. So what about the fact that when you're in the water, aren't you pushing the water around? You make waves when you're in the water, right? You're pushing the water 4 amot inside the water. So why is that not a problem when you're in the water? Because this is not an fenced area. This is let's say in the ocean.
Can we learn something about that? Water is not considered...
Well, that was a whole discussion earlier. And actually one of the principles that came out of that was kocho bekarmelit lo gazru. That indirect...
Carmelit.
Right, it's a karmelit. So what's indirect, in other words, motion that you cause, you're not responsible for in the karmelit. That's why they talked about pouring the water down the side of the boat, remember?
Right.
So because it's in a karmelit, and it's indirect, it's going to drip down by itself. So you caused it, but the fact that you caused it doesn't matter. You didn't directly transfer it from in the karmelit. So when you're walking with the water on you, you're actually transferring it. But when you're moving around in the water, and as by virtue of your motion, some water is moving, that you don't have to worry about. When it's on you, you have to worry about it.
If the water is moving and it goes outside of the pool, it's something different.
That might be a different story. If it went into a Reshut HaRabim, then you'd have to be concerned. Right. So, okay. Another halacha here. These are all just sort of brief halachot here. So, Amar Abai said, V'item Rav Yehuda, some say it was Rav Yehuda, that titch al gabe raglo, that if you have mud on your foot, mekan choba karkavin, mekan choba kotel, you can wipe it off on the ground, but not on the wall. Amar Rav Rava said to him, why can't you wipe it off on the wall? Mishum de mechazek boneh. Are you telling me that's like building because you're adding a little mud to the wall? Because mud was like what they made their walls out of a lot of times. So he said, ha binyan chakla'ahu. This is the binyan, this is the building of a farmer. Meaning, what kind of building is that, wiping mud on the wall? That's not building. Nobody's going to say, oh, you built something because you wiped the mud on the wall. So rather, what do we say? He says, no, the opposite way. Rather, you can wipe your mud off on the wall, but not on the ground. Because you might end up smoothing out the ground. That's a concern. Wiping on the ground is bad. Wiping on wall, good. Opposite of what he said. Itmar was stated, Mar Brei de Ravina, Amar Echad Zev Echad Zeh Asur Rav Papa, Amar Echad Zev Echad Zeh Mutar. So now we have a total of 4 opinions. Okay, we have Abaye who says floor that ground good, wall bad. Rava says floor bad, wall good. Then we have Mar Breid Ravina saying they're both bad, and Rav Papa saying they're both good. Lemar Breid Ravina b'mayim bekan chelei. So according to Mar Breid Ravina, who says they're all bad, you can't wipe off mud on the ground, and you can't wipe off mud on the wall. So b'mayim bekan chelei. What do you do if you have mud on your foot? You just have to walk with mud on your foot all day long, all Shabbat long? It says mekan chelei b'korah. What you do is you use a board, or you use a rock. You use something which is neither the wall, neither a structure, nor the ground. That's all. Or we would have like a welcome mat in front of our house. You could wipe your feet on that.
So he's concerned really that on the wall is building
and on the ground is, might be smoothing. So Amar Rav Rava says, Lo letev inish apumeh de lechaya, dilma migandera lechefetz, v'atela tuye. Now we're talking about, remember when they would make the mavoi, they would make these alleyways. So they would put a lechi or korah at the end. They had either a horizontal beam that went across or a lechi on the side to remind you not to carry from the mavoi into the main thoroughfare. That was a reminder. So it says, don't sit right adjacent to the lechi. Don't sit right at the end of the mavoi. Why not? Because if you drop something and it rolls out into the public domain, you're going to want to go get it. So don't sit right there. If you sit right there, then the likelihood is that you're going to end up carrying something because it's going to fall out of your whatever you have there in the mavoi is going to roll out into the public domain, and we wouldn't want that to happen. V'amar Rav, and Rava says, Lo litzaded inish kuba. A person should not firmly position a barrel in the ground. Dilma atelash v'yegumot, because he's going to end up flattening the ground. V'amar Rav, and Rava said, Lo lidok inish udra bepumad de shisha. Dilma ateli de sechita. He should also not fit rags into the mouth of a barrel or a spigot, basically, where liquid comes out. He shouldn't fit rags in there. Why? Because it's going to absorb liquid, and then you're going to squeeze it out. That's what you talked about before. In other words, that's when it's saturated. It's going to get saturated with liquid, and then you might squeeze it out, and that would be a problem. Rav Kana says, Tich al gabe begdo. If you have dirt on your garment, he says, "Mekaskasomi bifnim, then mekaskasomi b'chutz." You can rub the other side of the garment. In other words, if out here is some dirt on outside of the shirt, you can rub the inside of the shirt to make it fall off. But you shouldn't rub the outside of the shirt because that's too similar to laundering. It's too similar to washing in the normal way. Now Rashi says it wouldn't be normal laundering because real biblically prohibited laundering requires water, according to Rashi, although not everybody agrees with that. But that's what Rashi says. But he says it looks like laundering to be wiping a stain off of the front of your shirt. You should do it from the back of your shirt so that it doesn't look like it's the normal way. And he says, right. Okay, so Meitvei, there is an objection to that if you have mud on your shoe, according to the Braita, you can wipe it off with the back of a knife. And if you have something on your garment, scrape it off with your fingernail. But you can't squeeze the fabric, basically. In other words, you can't rub the fabric. Okay, you can scrape, but you can't rub. Rubbing is more like washing, because when you scrub something, you rub it. Okay,
so you have to flick it too.
Well, yeah, you can flick, you can scrape, but you can't rub. So that's what it's saying. So it says, so the Gemara says, my love shalei kaskes klal. Doesn't that mean you can't scrape? You can't rub at all. Lo, shaloi kaskes mi bachutz, aval mi bifnim. Rather, what it means is you can't rub from the outside. In other words, that sounded like a contradiction to what we said, because we said you could rub from the inside. So why does the Braita say you can't rub at all? So it says, no, that just means you can't rub on the outside. But from the inside, you're allowed to. In other words, from the other side, you're allowed to rub or squeeze a little bit to try to get the mud to come off, if that's what's necessary to get it to come off. Amar Rabbi Abahu, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Abahu said that Rabbi Elazar said that Rabbi Yanai said, Megararin min al chadash v'lo yashan. You can scrape a new shoe, but not an old shoe. Okay? Megararin means to scrape, I guess, off the layer of whatever. But not an old one. And Rashi says the reason is because if it's an old shoe, a layer is going to come off. In other words, if you have a nice new shoe and you scrape the mud off of it, it's not going to scrape a layer of the shoe off because the shoe is still in good condition. But an old shoe, you're actually going to scrape some of the shoe off itself and you're going to smooth out the shoe. So we turn to Amud Bet. Ba'mem megarero, what can you scrape it with? Amar Rabbi Abahu. Rabbi Abahu says, Begav sakin, again, with the back of the knife. with the back of the knife. Why do you use the back of the knife, like it said before, that you use it with the back of a knife? Because that's different from the normal way. In other words, not with the blade of the knife, but the other side of the knife.
You mean the handle?
Not the handle, but the other side, the flat side, the dull side. Yeah. So katad de sakin is the handle. That's what it talked about, chopping the peppercorns with the handle. Now we're not talking about chopping. Now we're talking about the dull side. Yeah, gavasakin is the dull side of the knife. Rabbi Abba said, Amar how sabah. A certain elderly man said, Samid didach, erase your teaching, mikameha, because I have a better teaching for you that supersedes yours. Detanei Rabbi Chaya, because the yeshiva of Rabbi Chaya taught the following: Ein megararin lo minal chadash velo minal yashan, velo yisochet raglo shemen, vehu betoch haminal o betoch hasandal. Aval sach raglo shemen umaneach betoch haminal o betoch hasandal, vesach kol gufo shemen umitagel al gabe katavleya ve'eno choshesh. So what is this talking about? It says you cannot scrape a new or an old shoe, according to the Braita. So that refutes what he was saying, because before Rabbi Abba was saying that you can scrape a new shoe, just not an old shoe. It says you can't scrape any shoe, and you cannot anoint your foot with oil and then put it into the shoe. While it's in the shoe. You cannot anoint your foot with oil while it's in the shoe. Why? Because that's going to actually soften the leather of the shoe. So it's like tanning. Okay? It's ibud, it's tanning. And you're not allowed to, or a sandal. However, what you can do is you can oil up your foot and then put it into the sandal. So it's very indirect. When your foot is in the sandal and you're oiling your foot, it's too direct. The effect is too direct. But when you put it on your foot and you put your foot in afterwards, it's not a direct tanning of the leather in the same way. And it says we can sach kol gufo shemen umitagel al gabe katablaya. You can anoint your entire body with oil and roll around on basically a leather mat. In other words, it's not a problem as long as you don't apply the oil when you're on the mat. You don't apply the oil when your foot is in the shoe. You applied it to your body, and then you want to roll around on the floor, you roll around on the floor. So Rav Chisda says, we only said this, that you can put oil on your foot and then insert your foot in the shoe when your intent is to shine the shoe, but not when you want to tan the shoe. So the Gemara says, "La'abdo pshita." What do you mean you're not allowed to when you intend to tan the shoe? Of course not. And are you allowed to shine shoes on Shabbat? What do you mean you're allowed to shine shoes? Ella. What he meant was, this is what Rav Chisda really said. Amar Rav Chisda lo shanu ela shi'ur letzachzecho, aval shi'ur le'abedo asur. What he meant was, if the person put only enough oil on their foot that it might make the leather shine a little bit when he puts his foot into the shoe, that's okay. But if he put enough oil on his foot that actually when he puts his foot into the shoe it might tan the hide, it's the quantity of oil, in other words, not the intention of the person. If the kavanah of the person is actually to tan the hide or even to shine the shoe, he's not allowed to do it. But what we're saying is if he wants to oil up his foot, as long as the amount of oil on his foot is only enough that maybe the leather will shine a little bit as a result, but it won't get tanned, then he can still put his foot in the shoe despite the fact that he has oiled up his foot. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Lo yetze katan b'min al gadol, aval yotzehu b'chaluk gadol. A child cannot go out with a large shoe. Why? Because it's too big. He's going to end up taking it off. You're going to end up carrying it for him probably. Okay? But he can go out in a big shirt because the shirt's not going to fall off. Even if it's too big, it will stay on. And a woman cannot go out with a torn shoe if the shoe is torn on top because she might end up being embarrassed and feel that she is, people are looking at her, and she's going to take it off and she's going to carry it, like we learned about earlier, right? That's something that she doesn't want to. We don't want her to expose herself to ridicule, and she can't use it for chalitza. So if she's married to a man who dies before they have children, and the man's brother has to do chalitza to free her to marry somebody else, she should not use a torn shoe to do the chalitza where she takes the shoe off, right? Vim chalitza, but if she did, chalitza takshera, it is kosher. The chalitza would be acceptable, b'diavad, but we don't use a torn shoe for that purpose in general. And you shouldn't go out with a new shoe on Shabbat. That makes sense for those who have difficulty finding shoes that fit. right? So you're going to go out and you're going to start to feel the pain that it's uncomfortable, and you're going to end up taking it off and walking, because back then they didn't mind walking without shoes from time to time outside. Today that's less likely to happen. And this is particularly for the shoes of a woman, because women were very particular about the shape and the feel and the size of the shoe, and therefore there was a concern that if she wore the shoe for the first time on Shabbat, she might not realize till she's already walking outside that it doesn't fit. And how many times have you had that experience? Everyone had that experience with their kids, that they put, oh, these are great shoes, oh, great shoes, great shoes. The minute you walk out, oh, these shoes, they feel uncomfortable. I don't like them.
Somebody this morning in the shoe or something,
Yeah.
he says women, it's very, they always wear shoes,
Tight.
Heels and things like that. Yeah. Baruch Shalom Asani Ishaz. That's why we don't have to worry about that. What am I wearing to the next? What do you have to wear? We never have to worry. It's the same thing all the time. Same shoes, same suit. The women have a lot of trouble with that, having to worry about coordinating. Today, Bar Kapara said, "Lo shanu ela shelo yatsa bo sha'achat mib'od yom, aval yatsa bo me'erev Shabbat mutar." This is only true if he never went out with the shoe, even for 1 minute, or she rather never went out with the shoe before Shabbat. But if she went out a little bit on erev Shabbat and made sure that the shoe was good, now even though it's brand new and she only wore it outside a little bit, she can wear it on Shabbat, because we assume that she would have been able to tell if it wasn't a good fit. Tanei Chada, we learned in one braita, shomtin min al me'al gabe imus, v'tanya idach en shomtin. That what they would do is they would take the leather and put it in a certain shape. They fit it around a certain shape. That's also how they make tefillin. Fit around a certain shape and let it harden on the shape. And then they would remove it from the shape. The shape was the shape of a foot, obviously, to make the leather take on its design. So the imus is sort of that thing that they would attach, that the shoe would be placed over. Okay? Now, so in one braita it says you can take a brand new shoe right off of that imus on Shabbat, and one says you cannot. So what is the basis for this difference? Lo kashya ha Rabbi Eliezer ha Rabbanan. This is actually a machloka between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, an argument between them. As we learned in the Mishnah, min al shal gabei imus. If you have a shoe that is on this structure, Rabbi Eliezer mitaher v'chachamim mitameim. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it's tahor, which means to say it cannot contract tum'ah. Why can't it contract tum'ah? Because according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's not a vessel until it's removed from that thing. In other words, as long as it's on that stand, it's considered unfinished. And therefore, since it's unfinished, it can't contract tum'ah. The rabbis say as soon as it has its shape, even though it's still sitting on that vessel and waiting to be taken off, it's complete. So too here, the rabbis will say on Shabbat, it's a vessel. It's not muktzeh, it's complete, so you can remove it. And the Rabbi Eliezer will say it's not a vessel yet, because until it's removed from that stand, it's not considered to be complete, and therefore on Shabbat it's muktzeh and you cannot move it. So then the Gemara says, Hanicha le Rava. This makes sense according to Rava. Shapir. This makes sense according to Rava, because he says that if you need to move something which is used for inappropriate purposes, in other words, its purpose is not appropriate to Shabbat. For example, this entity, this tool that shapes the shoes, that the shoes are affixed to, is a muktzeh, because you're not allowed to make shoes on Shabbat. So Rava, it's no problem according to Rava, because he says you can remove the shoe from it, because even though you're going to move the thing itself, you're moving it because you need to get the shoe. So it's no problem. However, because he says that whether you need an item ligufo for its own sake or for its place, you're allowed to move it. But for those who say, but according to Abaye, who says that you can't move something when you need its place. Okay, you can't move something when you need its place. So Rashi says, he explains here, Abaye, what's the issue? True that the shoe is a kli, it's a vessel. But imus mi'amilachto le'isurhu, v'zeh shomed mimenu at hamin'al eno tzarich legufo shel imus, ve'echem metaltele. The problem is that in order to get it off the stand, you have to move the thing, and you don't need the stand. Okay, you have to move the stand, but you don't need the stand. Now, according to Rava, as long as there's a need involved, you're allowed to move it. So it's no problem. But according to Abaye, you can't move the stand unless you need the stand for some permitted purpose. And you don't. You just need it to tilt it, to get the shoe off of it or whatever. So it's going to be a problem for him. So what is he going to say? It must be talking about where the shoe is very loosely sitting on there. So since it's loose enough that you don't have to move the stand, it's no problem. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer Maya Rafui Mutar, because Rabbi Yehuda said if it's loose, it's okay. Tamad Rafui Hala Rafui Lo. But again, now we have the other side of the problem. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it has to be loose. Oh, wait a second, it has to be loose. Why does it have to be loose? Shapir el Ravad Amar ben l'tzorch gufo ben l'tzorch mekomo mutar. My area rafoi afilo lo rafoi nami. That the problem is, according to Rava, we just said, you're allowed to move this stand that holds the shoes if your purpose is to remove the shoe from it. Even though you're moving something that's muktzeh because its main purpose is to make shoes, which is not a Shabbat activity, you're allowed to move it. So why would it have to be that the shoe is loose? Even if it's not loose, you should be able to tilt the stand and take the shoe off. It shouldn't be a problem. Why does Rava require it to be loose? Ha'id Rabbi Yehuda mishum Rabbi Eliezer hu detani Rabbi Yehuda omer mishum Rabbi Eliezer imaya rafui mutar. That this position that Rabbi Yehuda was saying is in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer, not in accordance with not reflecting an opinion that would be relevant to our discussion. So Rava will say that Rabbi Eliezer, who says that that as long as the shoe is on this structure, it's still considered to be incomplete. It's not yet considered to be a vessel. Rabbi Yehuda was qualifying that by saying, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, if it's loosely fit on there, that means it is done. And it can be removed. So Rava will say that teaching isn't relevant to the issue of Shabbat, because on Shabbat, to tilt the stand to remove the shoe should be allowed according to Rava, according to the Chachamim. As long as the shoe is not muktzeh, it shouldn't be a problem. According to Abaye, you'll have to say that the shoe was there loosely, so you didn't have to move the stand itself. Because to move the stand itself is definitely going to be problematic, according to Abaye, because you don't need the stand, you only need the shoe. And this was a machloket we learned earlier in the Masekhet that repeats itself many times, whether you can move a muktzeh thing only litzorech gufo, which is what Abaye holds. You need, in order to move, let's say, a hammer, you have to need the hammers for something. In other words, it has to become a Shabbat article, an article needed for Shabbat. The entity has to be needed. So therefore, to move something, let's say you left a hammer on the dinner table. According to Abaye, you can't move it.
Not even with shinui.
He doesn't hold by tzorach mekomo. He holds that the halacha is you can. Right. So, but Abaye throughout Shas says that if a hammer is left on the table, you can't move the hammer. Unless you need the hammer if you need the hammer to break nuts or something, it's fine. But just to move the hammer because it's inconveniently placed, you can't do it because you have to change. Basically, according to Abaye, you have to change the identity of the kli. You change the identity of the vessel because now you need it as a nutcracker. It's not a hammer now; it's temporarily a nutcracker. Oh, you reassigned it, so that's okay. Whereas according to Rava, even if you need the place of the vessel, so it's sitting on the table, and you want to eat on the table, you're allowed to move it. So this is a general machloket. The halacha follows Rava that we say that you can move a muktzeh item whether it is for its own sake, meaning whether you need the item or you're moving it out of the way for something else. But that's why they have an issue here, that according to Rava, to move the shoe stand thing in order to take the shoe off of it is okay, because you're moving it for a need. Okay? It doesn't have to be that you need the shoe stand, but you need to move it. Right? According to Abaye, unless you need the shoe stand, you can't move it. So the only time you'd be able to take the shoe off of it would be when it's loose and able to be slid off without much effort. And God willing, we'll continue here tomorrow. Hadron alach tolin, Hadron alach tolin, Hadron alach tolin, and Bezrat Hashem we'll start the 21st chapter of Masekhet Shabbat tomorrow, which is a short chapter.